single most important thing, the most important instrument that a writer has is absolute honesty with their readers. No, I'm only kidding. It's actually misdirection. Misdirection is wonderful. You can completely deceive and betray your readership, and they will thank you for it. You will have given them such a surprise that it will actually be delightful, and they will forgive the fact that you are clearly a incredible serial liar. There's ordinary forms of misdirection that everybody uses. The most common one would be only allowing your readership a drip feed of information so that they only get information when you want them to have it. You withhold the information about a thing until there is time to make the proper dramatic revelation. That's the most common form of mild misdirection. But you can aspire to some absolute genius pieces of misdirection. One of my favourites would be from the novel Magic by William Goldman. William Goldman was the author of Marathon Man, made into a film with Dustin Hoffman and Laurence Olivier. And the novel of that in itself contains some brilliant pieces of misdirection. I assume that it's one of William Goldman's favourite techniques. But in the novel Magic, it's an absolutely blinding piece of misdirection. He commences the novel talking about a stage magician who is performing in a club, and he's not entirely sure that the act's going to go well, but he's fairly confident because it's all set up nicely for the performance. The dummy has been planted in the audience so that after he's done a couple of clumsy conjuring tricks, which the audience will be starting to feel a bit restless about, at that point, Fats will start to shout out from the audience and heckle him, and the banter between him and this hostile audience member, Fats, will become the real act. It's a comedy act based around a magical act. And as the novel progresses, we see the central character, the stage magician, and Fats. We see their relationship. We see them talking in the dressing room afterwards, discussing how the thing has gone, discussing perhaps any possible improvements. And we see their personal relationship. And we follow this until one night in the dressing room, an argument develops, and it becomes increasingly vicious and increasingly personal, and they're both becoming increasingly angry until at one point the stage magician stands up, he picks Fats up, he folds him in half, he crams him into a suitcase, and he slams the lid shut. And at that moment, the reader thinks, he said on the first page, the dummy has been planted in the audience, but we thought that that was some technical term for a plant. We didn't realise that he's literally a dummy. And at that point, your entire previous understanding of the novel explodes and is made into rubble. And you suddenly see what the novel is really about. And that is an extraordinary feeling, to have your entire mental construct that you have built up in the course of your reading instantly demolished to show you the true situation. So, yes, that level of misdirection, you probably won't be able to do it straight away, but if you ever get the chance, jump on it as quickly as you can, if you ever have an idea like that, because it will make your novel into something extraordinary. Other forms of mild misdirection would include things like the magnificent last line reveals of some particularly skilled twist-ending authors like H.H. Munro, who wrote under the name of Saki. Saki's stories are magnificent. Often the very last line or the very last word is like a punch in the stomach. It brings the impact of the story home to you at, like I say, the last syllable. One of Saki's stories has got two noblemen living on conflicting estates that are adjacent to each other and that have been at war for decades, centuries, over some imagined slight between one family and the other. They hate each other. And the two heads of the household are out riding in a woodland that adjoins both of their estates. And they meet each other and they both have an accident where a tree, because there's a storm blowing, a tree has collapsed upon them. And they're both pinned down under the tree, and both men start out by saying that when my men arrive here, then we will put you to death like the dog you are. And they're both threatening each other about what they'll do when their men arrive. And then one of them, after they've been talking for a while, they've got to know each other, and one of them says, listen, if my men arrive first, and you've got no obligation to do the same, but if my men arrive first, you are going to be set free, and I'm going to take you back to my castle, and I'm going to feed you and look after you, and we can end this senseless rivalry that has consumed our families for so many years. And the other man says, thank you so much for saying that. And I say the same thing. If my men arrive first, then we will do exactly the same for you. Let us use this accident to put behind us all of this tragic misunderstanding. And so they're resolved. And then they see figures through the failing light. There is some movement coming in the distance. And they say, it's some men are arriving. Is it my men or yours? You can see better than I can. And the second man peers into the gloom and then turns round, and the last word of the story is wolves. It's incredibly impactful, and nearly all of Saki's stories were like that. And in fact, the man himself, it was like he conducted his own life, like one of his stories. The way that Saki died, it's got a great last line. He was in the trenches in World War I, and you may have heard of the superstition of the third light. The third light of a match was supposed to be unlucky. This had originated in the trenches because the first time that the match is struck and lights the first cigarette, that is when the sniper in the enemy trenches will notice it. When it lights the second cigarette, he will be taking aim. When it lights the third cigarette, that is the one that will get shot. So Saki's last words were, for God's sake, put that match, which is the perfect last line for a Saki story. There is a further form of misdirection, which is trickier still. This is where the author deliberately kind of misdirects themselves. I'd heard about this being a technique used by one of the brilliant female crime writers. I don't know whether it was P.D. James, Patricia Highsmith, it may even have been Agatha Christie. But what this writer used to do was, when writing her murder mysteries, she would just write about the murder, she would write about the reactions in the community, but she would not know who had committed the murder. She would not bother about that until about 2/3 of the way through writing the book, where suddenly it would hit her who must have been the murderer. So she can go back and make a few minor changes to sort of strengthen that. But the value of that technique is, if she didn't know who the murderer was during the early chapters, there was no way that she could even unconsciously telegraph that to the reader. So if it was a surprise to her, it's going to be a much bigger surprise to the reader. I remember an example of this from my own work, and in my experience, these things They happen by accident, well, at least in my case they do, rather than by design. But I was working upon a science fiction comic strip called The Ballad of Halo Jones. This was some decades ago. And in the first story arc, we introduce the main character, who is an ordinary young woman living on this gigantic hoop that is tethered just off Manhattan for housing the poor people so that better off people won't have to look at them. And we follow this girl through her fairly ordinary life in an extraordinary century. She's living in a shared house with an older woman called Brinna. Brinna owns a robot dog called Toby, who is an artificial intelligence and a very fierce killing machine that is for the old lady's protection. One of the story elements involved a shopping trip, which in fact took up most of the first book because 50th century shopping, it turns out, is a hazardous experience. During the trip, there is some reason where I thought, yeah, the two women, Halo Jones, the protagonist, and one of her friends, are accompanied by this robot dog. At one point I thought, actually having this invincible robot dog with them is going to spoil the story because that means that they can't get into any trouble. So I came up with a simple device whereby the robot dog says, look, I'm going to take a shortcut that only I could do, and I'll meet you on the other side of the hoop at such and such a time. And this happens, and the three of them then go back home to find that in their absence, Brinna, the nice old lady, has been murdered. There's been a home invasion, she's been killed. The vengeful robot dog says that he has got the scent of the assailant and he's going to go off and take care of it himself. Halo decides with her life in pieces that she's going to head off into space as a hostess upon this luxury liner, the Clara Pandy, that will be taking off quite shortly. So that's how the first book ends. She meets up with the dog again because it turns out that there was a legacy program whereby the old lady, in the event of her demise, was leaving the dog to Halo. So the dog accompanies Halo out into space. Here commences the second book. Now, I was starting to write the second book when I suddenly thought, oh my God, it was the dog that killed the old lady. He had opportunity because there was that whole bit where he wasn't with them, where he told them one thing, and then he told them that he was going to hunt down the old lady's murderer, but we never saw that. We were only told by the dog that he'd done that. The dog killed the old lady. Why did he kill the old lady? Because he knew about the legacy program? He'd gone mad and fallen in love with Halo, and because he knew he would be left to her, right. And at that point, that gave me a magnificent plot twist that ended the second book and was an enormous surprise to the reader because it was an enormous surprise to me. So, in summary then, misdirection is absolutely the one essential tool that you can have as a writer. Unless I'm lying.